In today's lecture, we're going to talk about the plasma membrane, which we've mentioned before, but we're going to talk about how it's composed, what it's made out of, why do we care, and what it allows the cell in the human body. So if you remember, when we talked about the different parts of the cell and we went on our tour of the cell, we mentioned that the cell membrane or the plasma membrane was that just membrane that surrounds the entire cell. So it's on the very outskirt of the cell. So here it says the plasma membrane is the boundary that separates the living cells from its non-living surroundings, right? So it allows everything that's inside of our cell to stay away from the external environment. And below this, it says the plasma membrane exhibits something that they call selective permeability. Okay, so if you think about that, if you break that down, selective permeability, what does that mean? Well, it's selective, and it's selective to allowing some things in while keeping other things out. So the bullet on the very bottom of this page says it allows some substances to cross more easily than others. And if you think about that, that would be important, right? We need some things to come into our cell. For example, maybe we need more nutrients or more fluid or something like that. We want to be able to allow nutritional substances into our cell, but we want to be able to keep other substances out as well. So things like microbes or maybe a lot of solutes, we don't want those coming into our cells. So the plasma membrane is really important in that it protects the cell, but it also allows certain substances to enter and certain substances to even exit. And they call that nature of the cell membrane selective permeability. So this is an illustration of the cell membrane. And we talked about all the stuff that's kind of surrounding the cell. We called that the extracellular matrix when we talked about the different parts of the cell and all the different organelles. But for today's lecture, we're really going to focus in on this layer that's kind of gray and yellow. And so if you remember back to macromolecules, we talked about something called phospholipids. And I said that was important because we were going to have to talk about it when we talked about the plasma membrane. Well, that's where we're at today. So if you're looking at this region, this gray and yellow region, those are lots and lots of little phospholipids that have come together to create our plasma membrane. So let's talk about the contents. Again, we've analyzed these membranes and we know that they're composed of different types of proteins and different types of lipids. And specifically, those lipids are called phospholipids. They're the most abundant lipid in the plasma membrane, and you could have easily seen that by that illustration you just looked at. But it says that they are amphipathic. So we need to break down this word amphipathic. What does that mean? Well, amphipathic means it contains both hydrophobic and hydrophilic regions that form a bilayer. And just in case we don't remember, because it's been a while, hydrophobic is something that's afraid of water. It's water-fearing. Whereas hydrophilic is something that has no problem being in contact with water. So what they're saying here is that the plasma membrane has both of these components. It's hydrophobic, but it's hydrophilic at the same time. Let's look at a picture and we can describe that in a bit more detail. So here's an illustration of the phospholipid bilayer. And again, we're just zooming into that picture we looked at a couple of slides ago. But what we see, looking at that, that layer that has the gray and yellow kind of structure, we know that it's composed of phospholipids. And let's just break one of these phospholipids down. And that's what they're doing in the image on the right-hand side. It's just really detailed and it probably looks pretty crazy. So if that's too confusing, you can just ignore that picture. But if you break apart the picture on the bottom, you can see that one of these gray circles represents the head of our phospholipid. And then off of it are two little yellow squiggles. And if you recall, those are fatty acid tails. So one of those is going to make up one phospholipid. And what it's saying here is that the heads of these phospholipids, the gray regions, are hydrophilic, which means they have no problem coming into contact with water. However, these fatty acid tails are hydrophobic, so they don't want to be anywhere near water. And because of this, this is what allows the phospholipid membrane to kind of line up the way it does. All of the tails are going to line up facing one another because they don't want to be in contact with that water that's surrounding the cell. However, the heads are hydrophilic. They don't have a problem coming into contact with water, so they don't mind being on the outside. Now, what's interesting about the plasma membrane is that these phospholipids can move around. They don't stay in one, certain spot. So they can move within the bilayer, and there's two types of movement I want you to be familiar with. On the left-hand side of this image, there's a little box with two little arrows that are right next to each other. And it says this is something they call lateral movement. And lateral movement is where one phospholipid that's right next to the other can kind of move around one another back and forth. It's lateral. Okay. Now look on the other side of the image, on the right-hand side, and you see there's another box with an arrow that's pointing up and down. Well, this is an example of flip-flop movement. And flip-flop movement is when one phospholipid on one side of the membrane is going to flip and then become on the other side of the membrane. So they're basically going to flip-flop, right? And you might ask yourself, well, why is it important for the plasma membrane or these phospholipids within the plasma membrane to move around? Well, kind of a cool example is when you might have an animal or a plant or something that lives in a colder climate. Well, if you get cold, what do we do when we start to get cold? We start to shiver, right? Our body's trying to create heat. So by allowing our plasma membranes to move around, by allowing these phospholipids to move around, it creates heat and prevents things from freezing as quickly. So that's just kind of a neat example of why phospholipids need to move around in a bilayer. Now, another factor that determines how fluid, if you will, these phospholipids are going to be within a membrane are whether or not they have kinks in their fatty acid tails. So it says here the type of hydrocarbon tails in phospholipids affect the fluidity of the plasma membrane. So what we see here is that on the image on the left, we see that there are these kinks in the tails. It says they're unsaturated hydrocarbon tails with kinks. Well, because these kinks are there, this plasma membrane is going to be a lot more fluid. It's going to be able to move around a lot more than the image that's on the right-hand side. The image on the right-hand side has something they call saturated hydrocarbon tails. And because there's no kinks, they can't move around quite as much. And so kind of referring back to that example we just talked about organisms that live in maybe cooler environments, what they've actually found when they've looked at the composition of these plasma membranes or these different bilayers is that animals that tend to live in more kind of extreme habitats, so maybe they live in a place where it's warmer in the summer but it gets really cold in the winter, they found that animals that are able to withstand those fluctuations tend to have more of those kinked fatty acid tails, and that allows them to survive the colder changes or the more extreme changes in temperature. Now, there's this big fancy model they talk about, and it sounds really scary, but it's really not. I don't know why they have to give it such a fancy name, but they call it the fluid mosaic model. And basically it just states that a membrane is a fluid structure with a mosaic of various proteins embedded in it. So far when we've talked about our phospholipid bilayer, our plasma membrane, we've only talked about the phospholipids that exist within it. And while that's kind of composes the majority of our membrane, there are also different types of proteins that are going to exist within and on top of our membrane. And they're calling this whole complex, if you will, a fluid mosaic model. And so basically it says it's a collage of different proteins embedded in the fluid matrix of the lipid bilayer. Now, there's two main types of proteins we'll find in our plasma membrane, and those are integral proteins and peripheral proteins. So let's start off by talking about integral proteins and what they do. Well, integral proteins actually penetrate through the entire plasma membrane. Okay, they're going to penetrate not only through the hydrophilic heads of those phospholipids, but they're going to go all the way through the hydrophobic tails and probably, in lots of cases, poke out the other side of the hydrophilic heads. So it says they're often transmembrane proteins that completely span the membrane. Okay, so they're going to be embedded within our plasma membrane. Peripheral proteins, however, are only going to be found kind of loosely attached to the surface of our membrane. So they're not going to be coming in contact with those hydrophobic tails. They're only going to be kind of hanging out or sitting on top of our plasma membrane. And here's an illustration of that. So let's look at these big purple blobs. They kind of look like lima beans to me, that are on the very outskirts of our plasma membrane. Well, we can see they're spanning the entire width of our membrane, and therefore we're going to call those integral proteins. However, look at the big they look like worms to me, big purple worms that are floating around on top of our membrane. Those are those peripheral proteins that are hanging out along the outside of the membrane. Now, again, talking about the fact that this is a permeable membrane, or it's selectively permeable, we have to mention hydrophobic or polar molecules. Well, it says here, hydrophobic molecules are lipid soluble and can pass through the membrane easily. Polar molecules, however, are not able to cross the membrane rapidly. So in order to get polar molecules across, we have to use something that we call transport proteins. And this is where those integral proteins that we talked about are going to come in handy. Because they're spanning the entire width of our membrane, they're going to allow the passage of certain types of molecules like polar molecules. So they're going to allow for the passage of hydrophilic substances to cross the membrane.